most of you know Gerry, and most of you probably, or a lot of you probably know him better than I do, but Gerry's been here since
dirt.
Since dirt. He worked directly with George Helmuth, and would you call George Helmuth your mentor?
Yes, absolutely.
And started there and ended up opening up a couple of offices for HOK around the country. But he'll let you know all about that history, and it's very interesting.
Thanks, Tim. This is a bigger crowd than I expected. I thought we'd maybe have 10 people here. It's a topic that's not nearly as informative as the Sustainable Design series, but maybe you'll enjoy something about it. People do seem to have a keen sense of their roots and history, and so I'll see if I can make you a little more informed about it. I think we're calling this HOK Historical Observations, which is really, it is largely anecdotal on my part. I've never put any kind of a prospectus together or a kind of a curriculum for this, but so it's kind of anecdotal, and when we get to a point when I've kind of covered the chronology, then the best part of the whole talk is the questions and answers and the spontaneous reactions. Why should we care at all about the history of HOK or the history of any endeavor? And I guess my feeling is that if you understand history a little bit, you tend to understand culture. And if you understand the culture of the place through the historical insights, you probably can understand the place's behavior a little better. So on the assumption that maybe we can understand how HOK behaves a little better, maybe it's good to know how we got formed. So first I'll do what Tim was starting to do, is give a little personal introduction so you get a frame of reference as to whether my observations are historically correct or even accurate. I started here in the fall of 1963 as a young architect trainee. I had spent 3 years in the Navy and the Civil Engineer Corps doing construction observation and contracts and that kind of thing, and I really enjoyed that work that the Navy allowed me to do. And so when I started here, I thought, well, that's what I want to do for my lifetime. I like this construction stuff, and I like being out in the field interacting with people. So I came and got an interview through Bob Edmonds, who was a year or two ahead of me in school at Washington U here, School of Architecture. Bob Edmonds got me an interview with Guillaume, of all people, although Guillaume didn't in those days, nor has he since, I don't believe, hire construction observation people for the firm. So I got the interview, and I was a month out of the Navy, and so Guillaume brought me in. I spent about $50 in those days making a portfolio of my student work, which was by that time 4 or 5 years old. Brought the portfolio in, and Guillaume just took it like this and flipped through it. And I thought, gee, $1 a page, he's going like that so fast. And then he put it down. He said, I understand you have some experience with what U.S. Navy's way of doing construction. I said, well, yes, sir. He said, well, good, because we have this project that the Navy hired us for, and it's a new campus in West Indies, 8 buildings. And it'd be good to have somebody on the team that knew the way the Navy expected to have the drawings prepared and the specifications written and all that. So he said, when can you start? So I said, well, I'm ready. Start next week if you want me to. So he said, do that. So on November 5th, 63, I started. About 3 weeks before the JFK assassination. I'll never forget that month. Paul Watson, oddly enough, started the same month I did. He started, I think, the same week. So started, but I didn't work for Guillaume. So of course, once you come here and you fill out an application form, they pretty well decide, based on your background, what you're going to do. So they assigned me to work for George Kassebaum, which was construction drawings and construction specs and observations, which was fine with me. That's what I wanted to do. So I just started doing that and started working on the drawings of 2 of these 8 buildings. And After about 6 months, to make the long story as short as I can, I got an opportunity to follow the drawings and the specs which I had worked on. Wound up actually writing the whole spec because they wanted somebody that knew the Navy's format. And then I got an opportunity to go down into the field and to oversee the construction of the job. So I thought, gee, this is fantastic. I got to work at HOK on the design, go down here and get it built. So I spent another 3 years in the field just putting pieces together for these 8 buildings and overseeing the architectural and the structural. I had another fellow with me who was mechanical and electrical, and so the two of us could cover all the disciplines of the job. So that was fine. I came back here just full of desire to be, eventually I wanted to be the head of construction administration at HOK. So that was my goal. There were some pretty good people there ahead of me, so I thought, well, might as well just roll up my sleeves and do this. So I got intercepted almost the first day I was back from the job site in the West Indies by George Helmuth, who said, you're going to go to work for me now in business development. I said, well, George, he was kind of like a legend already, and I didn't know him very well. Ovada had hired me, and George Castbaum put me to work. He said, well, I've had a few people have to leave on health reasons, and I'm shorthanded, and I've watched a few of those letters you've written when you were down in the West Indies, and so I think you're just what I need. I said, well, I don't know anything about marketing. I don't know if I'm what you eventually are going to be happy with. No, just follow me. I'll teach you what to do. And so that's the way I started. So all of my dreams about being a construction administration director went kind of out the window, but as life would turn out, this path was even more exciting and adventurous. So as you said, Tim, I wound up with George Helmuth as my mentor. And so from 1967 on, it was business development with an occasional duty on a project if the client really liked me during the interviews and wanted to see me on the job. Helmuth would permit me to be a project manager for a while or project architect. So that's my own background and hopefully my validity to give the historical insights for you. The firm itself started about 8 years before I came along to join it. And even that was a kind of a restart. The firm actually started in 1955 as HOK. It started 6 years earlier as Helmuth Yamasaki Lineweber, different name, but I need to even go back a little farther for you to understand why that transition was so natural. So I'll talk a little bit about the 3 principals who started the firm, and since George was my mentor, I'll start with him. George was born in 1907 and was the son of a really prominent St. Louis architect whose name was also George. And also George had an uncle named Francis, who was an architect, also practicing with his brother. So George grew up in a family of architects, was trained at the Washington U School of Architecture and then Fontainebleau in Europe. So George himself was a pretty accomplished architect and a good designer who did beautiful watercolor sketches all the time he was in Europe. And so when he came here, when he started, he went to go to work for his father and his uncle, and he discovered pretty quickly that in the height of the Great Depression, which was 1931, when George finally finished his student years and his travel in Europe, in 1931 we were in the height of the Great Depression. So there was very little work available for architects, period. And there was especially a dearth of work for architects who specialized in high-end residences. George's father and uncle actually designed many of the homes on Portland Place and Central West End here in St. Louis. Really wonderful, wonderful buildings. So the longest short of that was that George did not have anything to do. Couldn't get any work from his father because there wasn't any work there also. So he did a little bit of odds and ends. George himself at one time worked designing privies in Forest Park for the city. He got a job designing a lot of those stone restrooms that you see around the park. Did anything he could to keep body and soul together in those years. And then finally, he began to observe that his father, when the recession was waning, was coming to an end, George observed that his father was even going to have more difficulty getting jobs because there was a certain professional jealousy that had grown up between George and the other architects of the day. And so his father was kind of frozen out of the major commissions. So George got out of all that a kind of a deep-seated desire to do well and to learn how to practice architecture on a scale that would enable him to never be in a position that his father was in, no work and no support from the community because you were just regarded as another architect. So with some advice from his father to leave St. Louis and go learn how to practice on a different scale, George took his wife and I think 2 children at that point and just got on a train and went to Detroit and got a job as a draftsman with a firm that's today called the Smith Group. In those years it was called Smith, Hinchman and Grills. And this firm was doing a lot of the industrial work in Detroit, munitions plants and some schools, but a lot of more industrial type commissions than HOK today would be comfortable with. So George worked for a couple years as a draftsman, and then eventually, just like my path took me, he got drafted into the business development group at Smith, Hinchman and Grills, and went to work for a mentor of his own, a man named Henry Walton. And the two of them, George and Henry Walton, began to make the firm of Smith, Hinchman & Grills grow into something quite large. So from 1939 until 1949, George did that. He spent 10 years in Detroit learning how to practice on a grander scale. And while he was doing that, he accomplished a few things for the firm and also for his future. One thing he accomplished for the firm of Smith, Hinchman & Grills was to convince the senior partners there that they needed a star quality design leader. Otherwise, they were going to be always regarded as people who can do munitions plants and foundries. So George convinced them that they needed a pretty good designer who could take them places that they weren't going to go. So they allowed him to go find the design leader. And George went to New York, made a couple trips to New York, and located a young Japanese-American architect named Minoru Yamasaki, whose name went on to further greatness as the designer of the World Trade Center ultimately. George brought Mr. Yamasaki to Detroit and established him as a director of design, and that kind of shifted the culture of this firm he was working with into one of a more balanced firm that could do more diversified pieces of work. Secondly, when George was there, about halfway through the 10-year tenure, he has put down on paper a series of ideas and actually turned out to be a strategic plan initially written for Smith, Hinchman & Grills, but one that then became the basis for George's founding of Helmuth Yamasaki and Lineweber. George put down on paper, and I have a copy of it here. It's typewritten on an old manual typewriter, things scratched out and comments written between the lines. This is what he wrote, and it's this particular paper, while it's a strategic plan for a firm, it was called Operations and Functions of the Solicitation Department, which is where he was placed. So while he's talking about business development, solicitation is what he called it, he's really talking about how to grow a firm. So in that paper, which George authored, he had about 6 or 7 key principles that he articulated very clearly. And when you hear these, you'll probably smile because they become the genesis for what we are part of today. And so the first of his, what he called it, was a master plan for a depression-proof office. He didn't even think about firm in those days, it was an office. And the first tenet was never to depend on only one building type. Remember, Smith Hinchman was this industrial firm, so George convinced them to not depend on only industrial. His phrase was, develop a battery of building types to cushion any drop in demand for any one specialty item. So he then convinced people that they should be developing business in schools, shopping centers, hospitals, libraries, prisons, office buildings, the whole gamut of architectural practice that we know today. So diversification of your skills was number one. He then advocated diversifying location, because he said you can't expect good clients to always come to you. So go where the work is, which became the basis for the expansion of HOK later. Third item was to expand into subspecialties. Don't be content just to do the architecture of a hospital. You want to do the interiors, you want to do the lighting, you want to do the landscaping, the graphic design. You want to develop all those skills so that you can do a complete job. And then set up a systematic marketing program to actively cultivate, call on clients, record them, their names and details on index cards, and develop a kind of an organized approach to getting business. Prior to that, in his experience, it had all been word of mouth. Somebody at Smith Instrument Grills knew somebody at Henry Ford that wanted to build a foundry, so it was all word of mouth. So George said that's not good enough. We have to be more aggressive. We have to develop a way of finding those people before they even think to call us. Number 5 was, he said, it is important, mandatory, that we put some effort and some money into a professional public relations program. So that was the first time that the firm that he was with had heard about that, so they accepted that. And then this was something that I think he wrote in 44, but he didn't get a chance to implement it until 49. This was key to what we are. Organize the office for maximum efficiency by giving each of the major partners a separate function, so that you don't have studios where people are doing the same thing but in different building types. He advocated organizing the firm into a design leader, a project operations leader, office operations leader, and a marketing leader. So that then became the famous three-legged stool of HOK. So those were his tenets. Then we have to go back now to the historical evolution a little bit. So by 1949, Mr. Yamasaki was established in Detroit. George was practicing these tenets that he had developed. And by 1949, he decided that he could do this himself. So he left Smith Instrument Grills with Mr. Yamasaki and a gentleman named Joseph Lineweber, who was at that time kind of the senior dean of getting projects done. Joe Lineweber was a magnificent individual. I got to know him later in my career. And so the three of them left Smith Instrument Grills, and they formed a firm in Detroit called Helmuth, Yamasaki, and Lineweber. And it was to do... No? Well, there was a YLH first, and then by the time they got to 49, it had morphed into HYL. When it came to St. Louis, it became HYL. They were doing the same things they were doing before, but they were doing them for themselves. About that same time, George Helmuth began to realize that his roots here in St. Louis had caused some things to happen. Some people that he had gone to school with and were good friends with as a younger architect had now become more mature people in their own right, and they were in now positions of leadership within the community here. So George developed the idea of opening a second office for this new firm called HYL or YLH, and they opened an office in St. Louis on the basis of George's ability to develop business here and in Detroit. So in 1949, the doors opened, and it was Helmuth, Yamasaki, and Lineweber then. And they right away got the commission to do the public housing here, the famous housing projects that later on were demolished. They wound up doing the Army Records Center out on Page Avenue. And more famously than any of those was the airport. The Lambert St. Louis International Airport was just being designed. So HYL got hired to do the airport and those other large projects, and that gave them the basis for hiring some people. So they started and did pretty well. And about 2 years into that evolution, let's say by 1951 or 52, Mr. Obata had joined the firm. He actually had joined Smith, Hinchman & Grills, and then Yamasaki recruited him out of Smith, Hinchman & Grills and brought him to St. Louis. So Mr. Obata was hired as a young designer to work with Mr. Yamasaki, but to work here in St. Louis. And Yamasaki would live in Detroit, and he would have Gio doing things here, and then he would come to St. Louis, and they would get together and have a design review. By 1955, some things happened. The firm here was getting more successful, and Mr. Yamasaki began to realize that this young designer he hired was pretty good and was going to be a star in his own right. So out of apprehension about that, Mr. Yamasaki decided that he wanted the firm all centralized once more and brought back to Detroit. So one day over lunch, he just announced to George Helmuth that the firm would be closing the doors in St. Louis and all the people would be transferred to Detroit, and it would be better, more efficient to have one location than two. So before the lunch was even over, Mr. Helmuth just said, well, thank you very much, but that's not my idea of my future. And so you can take Detroit, I'll take St. Louis. So in 1955, with people who were already working, there were about 26 people in the office at that time, people who were already working. HOK was born, it was kind of made legal, new incorporation papers and so forth. So 1955, the firm was born, and that's where we start our history here, but it really was a carry forward of the HYL group. At that point, Mr. Helmuth moved from Detroit back to St. Louis with his family and concentrated all of his energies here, and the rest is kind of history. So what you see today is kind of a continuation of those basic ideas. Diversify in your talents, diversify in your locations, and diversify in terms of all the subspecialties that you are going to need and want as you go along. I think it's been pretty successful. Then the location thing didn't really get rolling until about the late 60s. You know, about 5 years after I joined, we opened our first office. It was a really bold step. We bought a firm in Belleville, Illinois. Bought an architect named Chuck King and opened an office in Belleville, Illinois. So it was a big step. And then we had the really big step in 1969 of opening a full functioning office in San Francisco. Prior to that moment, we had been doing a library at Stanford University, so we had a small project office in San Francisco. In 1969, the firm decided that was go west, so we opened the office in a full-blooded way. Bill Valentine was transferred from St. Louis to San Francisco to be the design director in San Francisco. He's now the CEO, or he's now the president of the firm. So it was a good move for Bill, and it was a good move for the firm, and the kind of the colonization began in earnest. A few years later, I was sent to New York, 1972. Paul Jolly's in the audience. He came with me kind of off and on. Paul was going back and forth as the money guy to watch over the New York operation. And then 2 or 3 years later, 74, we bought a firm in Washington, D.C., and that's the basis of the current Washington office. And I think the rest of it is all on the timeline. After Washington, there were things in Dallas. We were doing an airport in Dallas. Seemed logical to open an office there because Dallas was a boom economy. The airport was going to make it even more vibrant. So we opened an office in Dallas. King Graff, who is the executive vice president for business development to Mr. Helmuth, he relocated his family and went to Dallas. So the history has been one of this driving vision coming from Mr. Helmuth, bought into, I might say, and supported wholeheartedly by Casabom and Obata. This was not kind of a one-person driving the ship. The other two agreed with the plan and supported it. So the whole thing has been kind of an implementation of those ideas and then using that expansion and growth to give opportunities to talented people that were in the firm. So consequently, a lot of the leadership of the other offices is, if you go back to the more mature offices, the older one, those leaders came from here. They were transferred from here, saw it as an opportunity for themselves, and the firm saw it as a great growth opportunity for the firm. I'm not very good at the math, but I think in those early years, well, when Helmuth wrote this master plan, he was talking about a firm that could develop, like $1.5 million in fees per year. Today we do that on one project, but times were a lot different. When I started coming out of the airport, I got the grand salary of $5,400 a year to work here. But that was great because my Navy salary was like $3,600 a year. So everything is relative, but the numbers in the early years, the fee numbers, kind of make you smile when you go to that timeline today and look at it. And I don't think we cracked $100 million until the 80s, sometimes the mid-80s. So that's kind of the formal portion, if you can call it formal, but maybe at this point it'd be more useful just to talk, and I'll answer any questions you have. Dave, you're usually pretty good. What have I missed or not emphasized enough?
George Helmuth's story about U.S. Steel.
There are a number of great anecdotes about George, but this one is clean, and you can tell it. He was a very, very intuitive person, number one, but he was also a very good student of human nature. George would tell you, in fact, I read it once, but I could never read it a second time. He made me read the Lord Chesterfield's letters to his son. It's kind of a basic treatise on how to interact with people. When I first started in business development, George made me read that book, which was his, this Edwardian gentleman giving advice to his son about how to interact with royalty. So George had all these insights. So in the early 60s, let's say 64, 65, we got an opportunity to do an office building in Los Angeles for the Aluminum Company of America. And we didn't have a lot of corporate work in those years. We weren't even doing squib yet, I don't think. So this gentleman from Pittsburgh, vice president for Alcoa, said that he would be in George's office on Monday morning this following week to see if he could be comfortable hiring us to do this building in Los Angeles. This was going to be a speculative office building owned by Alcoa. So George said that would be great. So in those years, he used to like to spend his weekends at his farm in Shannon County. He actually enjoyed that his whole life. And so before he went to the farm the previous Thursday, he called King Graff into his office and George Hagee, who was director of design under Gio, and said, we're going to have this very important visitor. It's going to be in my office Monday morning, and we need to be smart about office buildings. And I want you two guys to spend the next day or two and really get in your heads what it would take to do this building. How would we work in Los Angeles? Is anybody here registered? So Monday morning, he said, I want you to be in my office at 8:30, and we're going to meet this gentleman, and then we're going to get this job. So King and George did that. They spent 2 days kind of researching with McGrail about what it should take to do the fees. And so they were very, very nervous about this because we had never done a job of this scale. So on Monday morning at 8:30, the gentleman showed up in the lobby, and George Helmuth wasn't in yet. He was still returning from his farm in Shannon County. So his secretary, Dorothy Forrest, got a little nervous, so she asked King Graff to go out to the lobby and greet this gentleman and bring him into George's office. So King did that. King was very gregarious. So he had King and George HOK himself. They were sitting there talking to this gentleman. Well, about 30 minutes went by and no sign of Mr. Helmuth. So this gentleman from Pittsburgh is looking at his watch, and there's not much you can say after you talk about the weather in St. Louis. And so finally he said, I don't know if I can stay much longer if Mr. Helmuth isn't going to appear. I think I'm going to have to get on my way, go back to Pittsburgh. So he started to close his briefcase. This is eyewitness testimony from King Raff, who was there living every painful moment of it. Started to close his briefcase, and at that very moment, Helmuth walked into the room. Now, what Helmuth didn't know when he walked into the room is that George HOK and King had had a few discussions in that 30-minute period about what the fee ought to be, because that was the primary topic that this gentleman came from Pittsburgh to learn. What is it that this HOK firm is going to charge me? So they had danced around, and finally King Graff had gotten enough courage to say that based upon all of our historical research, Mr. Smith, we believe the fee needs to be right at 6%. Well, that was the moment when the guy reached over to close his briefcase. He said, look, Mr. Helmuth isn't here. He doesn't care much about the job. You've given me a fee that's outrageous. I think our discussions are completed. So he's closing his briefcase as George walks into the room. George sits down in the chair and looks around and says, good morning, gentlemen. And the gentleman from Alcoa spoke first, and he said, Mr. Helmuth, nice to meet you, but he said, I'm afraid we're not going to be able to do any business. I've been here for a little while, and I've been talking to your two senior people here, and he said, I think your fees, which they've told me have to be 6%, are just not affordable for my company. So, Helmuth seized the moment, looked around and said, Mr. Smith, he said, what is the highest fee you've ever paid another firm to do a building of this type, in a different city even? The guy thought for a minute, and he scratched his head. He said, well, I think we paid Welton Beckett's firm 5.25% to do one of these in Oakland. And George got up from the table, and he put out his hand, and he said, we accept. And the guy was so dumbfounded, he shook hands with George. He said, all right. He said, we're going to be able to do business. George didn't know a thing about what the fee should be, but he knew that he better speak, and he better speak emphatically at that moment. So that's how we got started. We did the Alcoa building. Jerry Sinkoff went to Los Angeles as a project manager and worked out there for a couple years. And so it's just kind of one of many stories like that, Dave. One more story like that, I'll tell you, it's a lot briefer. We talked earlier about Mr. Yamasaki and his role in the development of this firm. One day in the 70s, as I was going back and forth to New York, George came back to New York with me one morning because I was in the Kahn and Jacobs HOK office. And we were flying up the Hudson River on the approach to LaGuardia. As we passed the tip of Manhattan, he looked down from his seat. George was by the window, and I was in the second seat. And he looked at the Twin Towers, and he said, Gilmore, he said, every time I make this trip to New York, I get a twinge of pride in looking at that work. He said, my pride is that I gave that guy the opportunity to do those buildings. He said, I didn't do them. He wasn't with me when he did them, but I think they're beautiful buildings. And I gave him the chance to do that. I put him where he needed to be. So, another Helmuth story. Questions?
How did HOK get such large commissions so early on?
Well, a lot.
Airport,
yeah,
a major airport.
A lot of it was George's energy and aggressiveness. He would do things. There was a gentleman in Washington that he met somehow that had just retired from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So George hired this gentleman as a consultant and said, we want to develop criminal justice buildings. So this guy was able to walk George around and meet people in the Bureau that were in a position to consider firms. And so when the prison at Marion, Illinois was built as a replacement for Alcatraz, there had not been a federal prison built in this country in 30 years. So it wasn't like we were competing with 5 other firms that had done 4 federal prisons each. And George, through his just gregarious nature and his insights into human nature, kind of knew how to get from point A to point B, and he knew that it wasn't always a direct line. Sometimes you had to go through point X before you got where you needed to be. But he set his sights on the larger work, but he wasn't so greedy about it that he would do just anything. One day, I went with him to Baltimore, and we were famous for a while as the architects of the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport because it opened its doors in the fall of 1974. So about 2 years later, we were invited to go to Baltimore to meet an engineer who said that Baltimore was going to do a new airport and he wanted to team with HOK. So I was directed to put the slideshow together and did all that, and we went up there and met the head of our Washington office, who was another retired general from the Corps of Engineers that George thought would be the right guy to keep a marketing presence in Washington. So we went to this firm in Baltimore, and George said, "Now you and Bob Matthew, you wait out here in the waiting room. I'm going to go in and have a preliminary conversation with this gentleman, and I'll come get you in a few minutes, and we'll give the story." And I had all these brochures on airports, two of them. We had the St. Louis airport and the Dallas airport, and we had started work on Lubbock at that point. So we had 3 airports in this skinny little brochure. So George came out after about 20 minutes, and he says, "Get your stuff, we're leaving." And I thought this was really strange. He came here to give this story. So we left, got to the rental car, and put all the stuff in, and we started driving away. And I said, "George, what happened here? You know, we're going to go after this airport." And he said, "Well, no, we're not." He said, "This gentleman told me that in order to get this airport, we'd have to put $10,000 into a sealed envelope, and he would get it to the right lawyer who would take care of see that we got the job." And he said, "I'm never going to do that." He said, "I'm never going to do anything that I don't want to read about in the newspapers the following morning." So we didn't do the airport, and later on that engineer was indicted in the Spiro Agnew scandal for kickbacks. George just had that really keen insight into know, how far to go and when to pull back. But he was also a very good judge of talent. Some of these people that he hired for these specialty items, Paul, we had a healthcare group back in the 70s, and it didn't bother George to pay somebody more money than he was drawing as a salary, because he knew that individual had the talents that the firm needed to get the firm positioned. And George felt that in the long run, I will benefit greatly. So that's kind of my anecdotes for the morning.
Gerry, what about yourself? What have you learned? What can you give us as a history lesson to us about you and how you've taken that knowledge and transferred it? Why don't you give us a few Gerry stories?
One thing you learn, man, is that you don't ever assume that what you have previously thought is going to be the only way that you can develop. Because when I had that visit from George in the fall of '67 saying you're going into business development, I thought this is the last day of my life. I don't know. I don't know what he's talking about here. But so one thing you learn is just kind of roll with the punches. And after a while, I discovered that there weren't any trick questions. After you had been going to enough meetings with George, enough interviews, you began to hear all the questions, and there weren't any surprises. So you got a lot more comfortable. You also kind of learned that there's great value in just working with very, very talented people, people who have a lot more talents than yourself, just like George had learned. So one of the great thrills for me personally, after 39 years here pretty soon, is just working with all the people, all the talent that I've come to know over those years, and see how the firm as a vehicle can give all of them an opportunity to do great things, and it accrues to everybody's benefit. That's one of the great strengths of this firm, is what it can do. Once in a while we lose 2 or 3 in a row and we get down on ourselves, and we thought, wow, is the magic gone? And then all of a sudden you get a win like Indianapolis, and then there's another win, and then pretty soon the momentum is back, and then you realize, then you go to the knowledge net and you read what's going on in London, the new commission's there, and finally you realize what the great potential of the firm is. And so that's just a couple of my personal satisfactions that I've experienced. Yeah, John?
Gerry, is there anything you think the firm should have done different? What you would have done different?
We won't tell.
Oh, you know, there's always things at the time, John, that you think could do differently. For years I struggled with the idea of the compensation system. How is this thing going to work when we got all these pockets of money? And, you know, but by and large, it hangs together, you know. Even when you find faults, it still hangs together. And I think it's part of it's the great goodwill of the people. And but yeah, when I do things different, I don't think I would change this plan, this growth plan, one bit. Maybe just try to do it sooner. All takes money, though. We know. When you see how far it came, and look at those timelines back here, and see what the fees were. We had maybe 100 people when we had $5 million a year in fees. So that's like $50,000 a person, and that isn't, haven't even paid your rent yet. You know, so there were some pretty bold, courageous people in those early years that sacrificed a lot to get it started. So I don't have a better answer for you because I really wouldn't change a lot. So you think you'll stay a while? I encourage you to do it. We had a healthcare guy here once. And I think you know him by reputation, a man named Jody Taylor. He's a very interesting guy with a physical handicap that he compensated for. And he told me once, he said, Gerry, I don't ever want to leave because this is like a soap opera, this place, and I want to see how it ends. You do kind of wonder how it's all going to play out, and you hope it doesn't end for many, many years. Yeah, Paul?
Gerry, maybe for the interns, maybe you could give them just some, 2 or 3 things to think about or advice, as they're sort of starting out their career.
Yeah.
What 1 or 2 or 3 things you would have them think about, or
okay. One thing.
The story about the envelope is good.
Yeah. Well, one piece of advice, and I follow this faithfully. I never worried about money. When you start at $5,400, you don't have a lot to worry about. But I never really worried about money. I didn't make a lot of demands for raises at the time. This sounds like a preaching, but it's not. But the firm is one that eventually embraces people who are talented and who are a good fit. So the money kind of comes if you're doing your job and if you let yourself grow, and the firm will recognize that. So money is one thing. A lot of people worry too soon, I think, in their careers about how much money I can make, how quickly, and all that's important. We try to be as competitive as we can in our salaries. And the second thing I think I would say is take advantage of every opportunity you get. And look. If I had insisted on staying in construction administration, I don't know where I'd be today. But so be open to change and pass if you need to be. When I told Mr. Helmut at the time he wanted me to come with him, I said, George, I really like this construction business. I think I could be good at it. This is going to sound cruel, and it's not meant to be, but he said, Gilmore, he said, I can hire those people every day. He said, this is something different, and you need to do this. So it kind of dashed my career plans, but it didn't last long. My disappointment didn't last long. So be open, and don't worry too soon about money. You have to look out for yourself, but the money will come.
Anything, Gerry, about closing the sale that you would like to share? An experience or just an observation?
Yeah, it's a very, very subjective, and there are jobs that we have won that I didn't ever understand quite why we won. And there are other jobs that I thought we had the thing hands down after the interview. I felt so good about what we had done, and we were so logical, and we didn't get it. So there's just something very personal and very emotional about the selection process, and it all hinges around chemistry, what the client types feel. So I don't really have any rule of thumb about when you know you're going to win, because I've been surprised so many times, and there are other times when, I'll tell one more story, and this is an example of when you weren't so optimistic that you're going to win and the right things happened. Some of these stories are in this book, which is still in the library. This book was written in 1984 by a man who had just retired as the architectural editor of Fortune magazine, a gentleman named Walter McQuaid. And he writes the book about what shaped the firm, so a lot of the things I talked about are covered in the book, but he also spends a chapter on each of the three principles, how they were shaped personally, how they grew up, and then the rest of the book is all about the work of the firm. But anyway, I had been doing this business development work for George for about a year, and one day I got called in to King Graff's office, who was the number 2 guy, and King said, "Jerry, I want you to come to work tomorrow with a suitcase packed, and you're going to just be a courier. I want you to carry some illustration boards to Dallas for a meeting. You're not even part of the meeting. You just carry this material down to Dallas." I said, "Sounds easy to me, King. I think I can do that." So I came to work the next day with my suitcase packed, and at the end of the day, he gave me this big zippered case with all these boards in it. There were some others being shipped as cargo. So he had instructed me to rent a car so that I could get to the hotel easily. He said, "So as soon as you get there, you don't even go to your hotel yet. You go to the apartment in Grapevine, Texas, of Mr. Tom Sullivan, who was the airport director." And they were building a new airport, and I had noticed Mr. Sullivan in the office, a week or two earlier, and he had been talking with Obata and King and George Helmuth. So I thought, well, this is duck soup. I'll just take these boards down there, and I'll get on the plane the next morning and come home. So I took the boards to the gentleman's apartment, and he ripped the papers off of them, and he looked at them, and he got a big frown, and he said, "Oh, my God, Gilmore, is that your name, Gilmore?" "Yeah." He said, "This is not what I wanted. I've got this meeting with the board of the airport tomorrow at 7 a.m. in the boardroom of the Republic National Bank." He said, "And I don't know if I can sell your firm or not." This was a very, very strange marketing effort, because this individual was going to sell us without an interview. And the reason that the individual wanted us to do the job was that we had done another job in Pittsburgh, which never got built, a series of 5 great high schools, and the whole job was about systematization, modularity of components, building components to build 5 schools with economy. And so this airport director felt that modularity and systematization would certainly apply to an airport. So he wanted us. So this material is delivered. He's very disappointed with it, and I didn't know what to say. So I said, "Well, Mr. Sullivan, let me go back to my hotel and make a phone call, and I'll call you back." Talk about one worried courier. I was driving the rented car to downtown, checked in at the Shamrock Hotel, and I called King Graff. By this time, it's 9:30. No, it's later. It's almost 10:30 at night. King's at home. I get him on the phone. I said, "King, there's something wrong here." I said, "This material that you sent with me doesn't seem to be the material that the gentleman saw in St. Louis and that you had promised to copy." And Jerry, he said, "Where are you?" I said, "I'm in my hotel room." And he said, "Stay there. Just don't even take off your shoes. Just lie down on the bed, take a little nap, and you'll be hearing from me in about an hour." So I did. I just lay down on the top of the bed and closed my eyes, and sure enough, about 11:30, the phone rang. It was King. He said, "Dorothy Forrest," that was George's secretary, "Dorothy and I are at the office. We're gathering these materials together, and I'm renting a plane at Midcoast Aviation." He said, "And that plane is going to be taxiing to the gate at Love Field at 6 a.m. And you're to be there with a cab with the motor running. And you go directly to the Republic National Bank and meet Mr. Sullivan before his board meeting." So I did. I had the cab. We were there at the general aviation area. Sure enough, this little Cessna taxis up, and this guy hands me these packages. And we get downtown, and I had called Sullivan the night before when I knew what was going on, and I said, "We will have the materials for you at 7:30 7:30 when you need them. So gave him the materials. He went in the meeting, and I didn't know what, I was just sweating bullets, sitting out there in that ante room. He came out of them. This guy was a great, not a comedian, I wouldn't say, but a great actor. He came out of the board meeting. He didn't have a smile on his face. He didn't have any expression at all. And he just said, "Come on, we're getting my car. I've got to call your office." So I got in the car. He didn't say anything at all. We drove from downtown Dallas all the way out to Irving, Texas, where his airport offices were. And we get into his office, and he said, "What's your number?" So I gave him the office number. So he dialed the phone, and he asked for Obata. And I thought my career is just about finished here, So Obata came on the phone. Thank God Gio was there that morning. And this guy said, "Gio, this is Tom Sullivan." He said, "I've got some bad news for you. I'm sitting here with your guy Gilmore." He said, "I've got some bad news for you, I'm afraid." And there was a long pause, and then a big smile broke out on Sullivan's face. And he said, "The bad news is that I sold your firm this morning, and now you got to design this goddamn airport. So how soon can you get down here?" I just sat back in the chair and collapsed. So, little things, just things change your career that you don't even realize are going to do it at the time. I wish I had 10 more like that, Ann, but I don't. Yes, Sue?
Based on your experience, would there be anything else that you would add to the vision, the original vision that George wrote?
I'd add computers. Well, I don't know, so I'd have to think about that. I'm not sure even George could cope today. It is so dispersed now, and so I think I'd try to find an ingredient that added something about don't feel like you have to control everything, because in those early years, for 20, 25 years, the three of them did really pretty much control everything, and they were great models at doing that. But today, I don't think you could do that. So I add another caveat about flexibility and. Make sure you have good people in the right spot and trust them, And the trust was always there, otherwise we wouldn't have grown. But I think I'd put it in writing. Yeah, Roger?
Will George's memoirs be published?
Pardon me?
Will George's memoirs be published?
Well, that's a good question. 3 years ago, last month, I was invited out to George's home for lunch. And he had a draft of this book he had written, but the draft only covered the years until he formally retired, I think, which was in 1988. And he said, "Gerry, I'm working on this draft. I've been working on it for a couple of years. I would like you to agree to, number one, edit this draft, because I've just written my thoughts." And he said, I like the way you write. And secondly, I'd like you to write in my style, if you can. I'd like you to write the chapters that would cover the firm's evolution in the years since I have stepped down. So I agreed to do that. And he wanted to give me the manuscript that day at lunch. And his wife, Mimi, said, "George, I think it's unfair to Gerry to do that, because you and I need to do some more editing, because this is much too voluminous." So I said, "Okay, well, whenever you're ready, George, I'd be happy to take on the task." I didn't know how much time I could spend on it right away, but so the manuscript stayed, and then George got quite ill, like in September of that year, and then he died in November. So I think right now the manuscript rests with the Helma's son, Teddy. I think it's in his possession. So every once in a while I say something to John Mann about, do we want to do something with this? And definitely the firm does. So I think, Roger, the answer is that I probably will do it, but it's right now it's kind of in limbo, and nobody has pushed lately. I think some of the memoirs are a lot more personal, are they not, Dave? Dave, by the way, there's another great resource to you interns if you haven't taken advantage of it, and that's, if you're interested in all this, is the videotapes that Dave Munson has. That, how many hours of George's conversations did you tape?
6 videotapes of George in '83. And there's a half-hour version and there's a 1-hour version. Some of them never will be seen again. It was pretty good.
Yeah.
But they're
So-
both in the library. Then there's also the Obata story.
Yeah.
And one of these days, the Castle kids gave me all of George's memoirs. But I don't have any plans for doing anything with them right now.
The one thing I didn't get a chance to talk about much is the personalities of the other two. I think I spent a lot of time dwelling on my own mentor, George Helmuth, but the other two were equally strong and great leaders. George Kasbaum was the kind of individual, his door was always open. And he prided himself on his ability to give advice, career advice or personal advice to anybody that really wanted to take the time to come see him. He gave me some advice about my career that I really valued. And he, of course, was very interested in the profession and our role in the profession, but also other architects. And so George at one time served as the national president of the AIA, and that was a role which George Helmuth and Guillaume Obata encouraged George to do. So, yeah, there were three very, very strong leaders. Sometimes they disagreed, but they never ever had to vote. There was never a 2-to-1 vote on anything. They always achieved some kind of a consensus or agreement about whatever it was, expansion at that moment, or they always were able to work it out. Yeah, Mike?
Can you talk about your feelings on the future of architecture and the future of the firm, where it lies?
Well, yeah, it's easy to get into a trap. When I think about the future of architecture, I think there's a lot of static right now, and there's a lot of static about essentially around delivery systems. So I think there's for right now anyway, there's this kind of this twin path, which is there's a path where great architecture can always be valued, and you can, if you're really great, you can be hired. There's also the path which is one of collaboration, and that's when I'm talking about the delivery systems. I think there's going to be a lot more emphasis on the design-build methodology. That's why I'm so pleased that HOK has grown into that. So that by itself, design-build, will never produce great buildings. So I think there's also always has to be a balance between the opportunities that you pursue and accept in the design-build mode and the opportunities for really terrific architecture. So the answer is you can do them both. They'll both be valued, but I think we need to pursue them both. We need to improve the quality of the design product and also improve our ability to interact with other forces in the construction industry that are affecting us. A lot of it's about price these days and commoditization of our services. So I mean, you have to really be sharp, and you really have to have something to add to the mix other than just price. Otherwise, you die. And I think so far we've done a pretty good job of having that.
Well, that really mirrors George Helmuth's legacy of diversification.
Right.
That you can't be in one building type, or in this case, a service.
Right. Yeah. It was interesting to watch over the years how this model prevailed, but there were different stars leading the model. I mean, we've had interiors directors, we've had healthcare directors, we've had airport directors, criminal justice directors, and some of those faces change, but the model itself remains. And there are times when we de-emphasize it for a while the offices gain prominence, and then we come back and emphasize the specialization model again. So we never lose it, and I think right now it's really strong, and it's proper for our climate today.